I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashworth, but Mr. Benjamin called this morning to cancel, my housekeeper Lucia whispered as she found me sitting alone at the elegantly set dining table for 14, wearing my best sapphire dress and the diamond bracelet my late husband had given me for our golden anniversary, surrounded by untouched birthday cake and wilting orchids. Still waiting at 9 p.m. for the son who had promised to celebrate my 80th milestone, but never intended to show up. What happened next with my revised will and the humble gardener who had been the only person to remember my birthday would leave my entitled family scrambling to understand how they just lost the most significant inheritance in Vermont's history. I'm sharing this story with you today, and I hope you'll stay until the very end to see how one moment of birthday abandonment became the catalyst for the most satisfying act of justice I've ever witnessed. Please comment below about the most meaningful gesture someone has ever made for you on your birthday, so I can see how many of you understand that presence is worth more than presents. My name is Eleanor Beatrice Ashworth, and at 80 years old, I believed I had learned to navigate the complexities of family relationships with grace and wisdom. Never in my wildest imagination could I have predicted that my own milestone birthday would become the moment when I finally understood the true character of the family I had spent 8 decades nurturing, supporting, and loving unconditionally. I reside in Shelburne, Vermont, in a magnificent Georgian colonial estate that my late husband Winston and I purchased in 1968, when we were ambitious young professionals establishing ourselves in Burlington's financial district. The 15-acre property on Spear Street wasn't merely our dream home, it was the cornerstone of everything we built together over 54 years of marriage, the foundation for the wealth management firm that made us one of the most respected families in Chittenden County. The house itself chronicles the story of our journey from determined young entrepreneurs to pillars of Vermont society. When we acquired the property, it was a stunning but neglected 1920s mansion with exquisite architectural details but mechanical systems that hadn't been updated since the Truman administration. We devoted our first 15 years there methodically restoring every room, studying European antiques and American folk art, creating the kind of sophisticated family environment where we could raise children while hosting the influential clients who were building our fortune. Winston had established Ashworth Financial Services in 1971, with just me as his partner and a cramped office above a bookstore in downtown Burlington. By 1978, we were managing investment portfolios for some of the most successful executives throughout New England. By 1988, we had branch offices in 4 states and were advising family trusts with assets exceeding $200 million. By 1998, when Winston experienced his first mild stroke, our firm was generating over $4 million annually in management fees and advisory revenue. I had been considerably more than just the supportive spouse throughout those foundational years. While Winston cultivated relationships with high-net-worth individuals and institutional clients, I managed every operational component of the business from our sophisticated home office. I conducted market research, developed investment strategies, maintained our expanding database of client portfolios and financial objectives, and handled the complex estate planning services that kept our affluent clients loyal for decades. When Shelburne's prominent families needed guidance on trust structures or tax optimization, they consulted Eleanor Ashworth. When corporate leaders required confidential advice about merger opportunities or executive compensation packages, they trusted Ashworth Financial Services. My expertise in tax law and wealth preservation strategies had become renowned among the most successful families in Vermont. When Winston died from complications following his 3rd stroke 7 years ago, I inherited not only the estate and the financial services firm, but an investment portfolio worth $4.8 million, including the business, commercial real estate throughout Vermont and New Hampshire, a mountain retreat and stow, and meticulously cultivated equity and bond investments that Winston had been accumulating since our honeymoon. At 73, I suddenly found myself one of the wealthiest widows in Vermont, a status that apparently triggered a remarkable transformation in how my only son Benjamin, who had always insisted everyone address him as Ben, despite being named after his great-grandfather, was 54 years old and had spent his entire adult life engaged in what he diplomatically described as
entrepreneurial pursuits, but what I recognized as an inability to commit to any venture that demanded genuine effort or personal accountability. He'd attempted investment advising, commercial real estate development, restaurant ownership, organic farming, and most recently had convinced himself he was a successful technology consultant, despite 5 failed startup attempts that had cost me over $275,000 in development capital that was never repaid.
Ben's wife, Stephanie, came from an established Manhattan family whose pharmaceutical fortune had evaporated sometime during the 2008 financial crisis, leaving her with sophisticated tastes, inflexible social expectations, and absolutely no practical experience generating the income necessary to sustain her lifestyle requirements. They occupied a sprawling farmhouse in Heinsberg that strained their finances beyond reasonable limits, raising 2 teenage children, my granddaughter Isabella, 18, and my grandson Winston, named after his great-grandfather, 16, who attended the most prestigious preparatory schools in Vermont on what I now understood was predominantly my financial support disguised as academic gifts and grandmother's educational investments. For 7 years since Winston's death, I had functioned as my son's family's financial foundation, consistently approached with meticulously crafted appeals for assistance that invariably seemed urgent and temporary, but somehow never resulted in the promised financial independence. A business opportunity that required minimal investment to guarantee substantial returns. Preparatory school tuition that had unexpectedly exceeded their budgeted amounts. Mortgage obligations that were temporarily challenging due to unforeseen market fluctuations. I contributed generously because I loved them profoundly and wanted to ensure my grandchildren enjoyed every advantage for future success. But I was becoming increasingly troubled by patterns that seemed to intensify annually. None of my financial assistance was ever acknowledged as the considerable sacrifice it represented from a widow managing fixed assets, and none of it was ever repaid despite elaborate promises and detailed repayment schedules. When Ben required $85,000 to prevent foreclosure on his Heinsberg property, it was presented as a short-term bridge loan that would certainly be repaid within 10 months once his latest consulting contract started generating revenue. 3 years later, the money had never been mentioned again, and Ben's consulting business had quietly vanished without explanation. When Stephanie needed assistance with Isabella's college preparation expenses, standardized test coaching, admissions consultants, application fees, campus visits to exclusive East Coast universities, it evolved into an ongoing expectation rather than grateful acceptance of extraordinary generosity from a grandmother who wanted to guarantee her granddaughter's educational opportunities. When Ben's organic farming venture required expensive equipment, greenhouse construction, and specialized soil preparation, my funding was treated as an obvious investment in his agricultural success rather than a substantial gift that represented months of my careful financial planning. But what disturbed me most profoundly was how Ben's attitude toward me had transformed since Winston's death. The accomplished, intelligent woman who had co-developed a multi-million-dollar wealth management enterprise was now being treated like a confused, isolated widow who needed constant supervision to avoid making poor decisions with her inheritance. Every financial decision I contemplated was questioned with patronizing concern. When I mentioned wanting to renovate the estate's conservatory to better display my collection of rare orchids, it was met with worried discussions about my ability to manage complex construction projects at my advanced age. When I discussed contributing to the Shelburne Museum's endowment campaign, it was dismissed as emotional decision-making that I might regret once I considered more carefully the importance of preserving assets for family security. When I explored selling our Stowe Mountain property because maintaining multiple residences was becoming overwhelming, I was advised that I wasn't thinking rationally about long-term real estate appreciation and should probably consult with someone more experienced before making major asset decisions. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. I was systematically being repositioned as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose independence was potentially hazardous, and whose substantial wealth needed protection from my own supposedly declining decision-making capabilities.
The woman who had successfully managed complex client portfolios and sophisticated investment strategies for 40 years was suddenly being treated as if she might accidentally squander the family fortune through confused thinking or emotional impulses. This particular birthday celebration was intended to be especially significant. Reaching 80 felt like a genuine milestone worthy of commemorating with the people who mattered most in my life. I had spent over a month planning what I envisioned would be an elegant but intimate gathering, just family and several cherished friends assembling in the estate's formal dining room for dinner prepared by the caterer who had handled all our important entertaining for the previous 15 years. Ben had appeared genuinely enthusiastic when I extended the invitation 8 weeks earlier. "Mother, we absolutely wouldn't miss your 80th birthday for anything in the universe," he had declared with apparent conviction. "This represents a tremendous milestone, and we want to make this celebration truly memorable for you." We had extensively discussed the guest arrangements, menu preferences, even the floral displays I wanted positioned throughout the house. Stephanie had volunteered to coordinate with the catering service, and my grandchildren had promised to prepare special presentations about their academic achievements to share during the dinner celebration.
But as the date approached, communications became increasingly ambiguous. Ben would mention being overwhelmed with client demands when I telephoned to confirm arrangements. Stephanie seemed distracted and unengaged when I attempted to discuss final preparations. My grandchildren stopped responding to my calls entirely. The morning of my birthday dawned with the kind of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. Lucia, my housekeeper, who had been with our family for 18 years, had arrived early to assist with concluding preparations. The estate looked absolutely magnificent. Fresh floral arrangements in every room, the finest china and crystal arranged for 14 guests, the dining room table decorated with the elaborate centerpieces I had been designing for weeks. At 9:30 a.m., I telephoned Ben to confirm the arrival schedule we had established. The call transferred immediately to voicemail. At 11:45 a.m., I attempted Stephanie's number. No response. At 1:15 p.m., increasingly worried that some family crisis might have occurred, I tried both numbers repeatedly and sent multiple text messages inquiring if everyone was safe. At 3:45 p.m., with guests scheduled to arrive at 6 o'clock, Ben finally returned my call. "Mother, I'm genuinely sorry, but something significant developed at work," he announced with the casual tone someone might employ to postpone a routine lunch appointment. "Stephanie's managing some complications with Isabella's college applications, and the children have academic obligations. We're not going to be able to attend tonight." I stood in my beautifully decorated home, wearing the sapphire dress I had purchased specifically for this milestone celebration, holding the telephone in stunned silence as my son canceled my 80th birthday party 4 hours before guests were expected to arrive. "Benjamin," I managed to respond, "this is my 80th birthday celebration. We've been planning this gathering for 2 months. I have professional catering arriving, flowers throughout the estate, 14 people expecting an elegant dinner." "I understand, Mother, and I feel absolutely terrible about the timing," he replied, not sounding terrible whatsoever. "But this work situation demands immediate attention, and you're aware how stressful college application processes can be. We'll definitely compensate for this. Perhaps we can arrange lunch next weekend or something similar." Next weekend or something similar to compensate for missing my 80th birthday celebration? After disconnecting, I remained in my living room for nearly an hour, attempting to process what had transpired. My only child had canceled my milestone birthday celebration with 4 hours' notice, offering a future lunch as adequate compensation for missing what could be my final major birthday celebration. I began the painful process of telephoning guests to cancel the dinner party, explaining that a family emergency had necessitated postponement. Each conversation felt like a small humiliation, another reminder that my son's priorities didn't include honoring his mother's most significant birthday.
Mrs. Adeline Thornton, my closest friend from the Shelburne Garden Club, was particularly understanding. Eleanor, dear, these things happen, but I do hope Benjamin realizes what a special woman he has for a mother. Not everyone would plan such an elaborate celebration with such attention to detail. Mr. Harrison Webb, Winston's former business partner, seemed genuinely disappointed. Eleanor, I was looking forward to toasting your remarkable achievements tonight. You've built something truly special with Ashworth Financial Services, and reaching 80 deserves proper recognition. As I continued making cancellation calls, I found myself explaining and apologizing for my son's absence, making excuses for behavior that had no reasonable justification. The accomplished businesswoman, who had commanded respect from Vermont's financial elite, was reduced to making apologetic explanations for why her own son couldn't be bothered to attend her 80th birthday. But what happened next would demonstrate that there are individuals in this world who understand the genuine meaning of loyalty and respect, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships aren't determined by genetics, but by character. At 5:45 p.m., as I was completing the final cancellation calls, I heard a gentle tapping on the conservatory door. Standing outside was Diego Martinez, the 43-year-old head gardener who had been maintaining our estate's grounds for 14 years. Diego was holding a small, carefully wrapped package and wearing his finest Sunday attire instead of his customary work clothes. His usually rugged hands were clean and manicured, and he had clearly taken considerable time preparing for this visit. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, with the respectful formality he always maintained, "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to wish you a very happy 80th birthday. I know today represents your special celebration." In that moment, standing at my conservatory door with a sincere smile and a thoughtful gift, Diego Martinez demonstrated more genuine consideration and respect than my own son had exhibited in months. "Diego," I said, genuinely surprised and touched by his thoughtfulness, "please come inside. Thank you so much for remembering." As I invited him into my home, I noticed the care he had taken with his appearance, the obvious thought he had invested in selecting an appropriate gift, and the genuine warmth in his expression as he wished me happy birthday. "Mrs. Ashworth," he continued as he entered the conservatory, "I brought you something from my own garden. I know how much you love rare orchids, so I cultivated this variety specifically for your birthday. It's called Phalaenopsis Blumei Eleanor. I had it specially registered with that name in honor of your kindness to me and my family over all these years." But as the date approached, communications became increasingly ambiguous. Ben would mention being overwhelmed with client demands when I telephoned to confirm arrangements. Stephanie seemed distracted and unengaged when I attempted to discuss final preparations. My grandchildren stopped responding to my calls entirely. The morning of my birthday dawned with the kind of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. Lucia, my housekeeper, who had been with our family for 18 years, had arrived early to assist with concluding preparations. The estate looked absolutely magnificent. Fresh floral arrangements in every room, the finest china and crystal arranged for 14 guests, the dining room table decorated with the elaborate centerpieces I had been designing for weeks. At 9:30 a.m., I telephoned Ben to confirm the arrival schedule we had established. The call transferred immediately to voicemail. At 11:45 a.m., I attempted Stephanie's number. No response. At 1:15 p.m., increasingly worried that some family crisis might have occurred, I tried both numbers repeatedly and sent multiple text messages inquiring if everyone was safe. At 3:45 p.m., with guests scheduled to arrive at 6 o'clock, Ben finally returned my call. "Mother, I'm genuinely sorry, but something significant developed at work," he announced with the casual tone someone might employ to postpone a routine lunch appointment. "Stephanie's managing some complications with Isabella's college applications, and the children have academic obligations. We're not going to be able to attend tonight." I stood in my beautifully decorated home, wearing the sapphire dress I had purchased specifically for this milestone celebration, holding the telephone in stunned silence as my son canceled my 80th birthday party 4 hours before guests were expected to arrive. "Benjamin," I managed to respond, "this is my 80th birthday celebration. We've been planning this gathering for 2 months. I have professional catering arriving, flowers throughout the estate, 14 people expecting an elegant dinner." "I understand, Mother, and I feel absolutely terrible about the timing," he replied, not sounding terrible whatsoever. "But this work situation demands immediate attention, and you're aware how stressful college application processes can be. We'll definitely compensate for this. Perhaps we can arrange lunch next weekend or something similar." Next weekend or something similar to compensate for missing my 80th birthday celebration? After disconnecting, I remained in my living room for nearly an hour, attempting to process what had transpired. My only child had canceled my milestone birthday celebration with 4 hours' notice, offering a future lunch as adequate compensation for missing what could be my final major birthday celebration. I began the painful process of telephoning guests to cancel the dinner party, explaining that a family emergency had necessitated postponement. Each conversation felt like a small humiliation, another reminder that my son's priorities didn't include honoring his mother's most significant birthday. Mrs. Adeline Thornton, my closest friend from the Shelburne Garden Club, was particularly understanding. "Eleanor, dear, these things happen, but I do hope Benjamin realizes what a special woman he has for a mother. Not everyone would plan such an elaborate celebration with such attention to detail." Mr. Harrison Webb, Winston's former business partner, seemed genuinely disappointed. "Eleanor, I was looking forward to toasting your remarkable achievements tonight. You've built something truly special with Ashworth Financial Services, and reaching 80 deserves proper recognition." As I continued making cancellation calls, I found myself explaining and apologizing for my son's absence, making excuses for behavior that had no reasonable justification. The accomplished businesswoman, who had commanded respect from Vermont's financial elite, was reduced to making apologetic explanations for why her own son couldn't be bothered to attend her 80th birthday. But what happened next would demonstrate that there are individuals in this world who understand the genuine meaning of loyalty and respect, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships aren't determined by genetics, but by character. At 5:45 p.m., as I was completing the final cancellation calls, I heard a gentle tapping on the conservatory door. Standing outside was Diego Martinez, the 43-year-old head gardener who had been maintaining our estate's grounds for 14 years. Diego was holding a small, carefully wrapped package and wearing his finest Sunday attire instead of his customary work clothes. His usually rugged hands were clean and manicured, and he had clearly taken considerable time preparing for this visit. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, with the respectful formality he always maintained, "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to wish you a very happy 80th birthday. I know today represents your special celebration." In that moment, standing at my conservatory door with a sincere smile and a thoughtful gift, Diego Martinez demonstrated more genuine consideration and respect than my own son had exhibited in months. "Diego," I said, genuinely surprised and touched by his thoughtfulness, "please come inside. Thank you so much for remembering." As I invited him into my home, I noticed the care he had taken with his appearance, the obvious thought he had invested in selecting an appropriate gift, and the genuine warmth in his expression as he wished me happy birthday. "Mrs. Ashworth," he continued as he entered the conservatory, "I brought you something from my own garden. I know how much you love rare orchids, so I cultivated this variety specifically for your birthday. It's called Phalaenopsis Blumei Eleanor. I had it specially registered with that name in honor of your kindness to me and my family over all these years."
"Mrs. Ashworth, Diego said as he prepared to leave. "I hope you won't think this presumptuous, but my wife Rosa prepared some traditional Mexican birthday pastries this morning when I told her about your celebration. If you'd like, I could bring them over and we could have a small birthday celebration right here in the conservatory with your beautiful orchids." The offer was so genuine and thoughtful that I felt tears forming in my eyes. Here was someone offering to salvage my ruined birthday, not out of obligation or expectation of reward, but simply because he believed I deserved to have my milestone properly acknowledged. "Diego, that would be wonderful," I said, "but only if Rosa can join us. I'd love to meet the woman who raised such a thoughtful family." An hour later, I found myself celebrating my 80th birthday in the conservatory with Diego, his wife Rosa, and their daughter Maria, who had driven over from her part-time job to join the impromptu celebration. Rosa had brought homemade tres leches cake, traditional Mexican hot chocolate, and handmade flowers crafted from colorful tissue paper. It wasn't the elaborate formal dinner I had planned, but it was something far more precious. A genuine celebration with people who understood that birthdays matter, that reaching 80 deserved recognition, and that showing up for someone you care about is a fundamental expression of respect and love. As we sat among the orchids, sharing stories and laughter, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in years, the warmth of being truly valued by people who expected nothing from me except the privilege of sharing in my joy. Rosa told me stories about her own grandmother's 90th birthday celebration in Guadalajara, where 3 generations of family had traveled from across Mexico to honor the matriarch who had held their family together through decades of challenges. Maria shared her excitement about starting college and her dream of designing public gardens that would bring beauty to underserved communities throughout Vermont. Diego presented me with a handwritten journal that documented every variety of plant, tree, and flower that had been cultivated in our gardens during his 14 years of service. The journal contained detailed notes about each plant's care requirements, blooming seasons, and special characteristics, along with photographs showing the garden's evolution over the years. "Mrs. Ashworth," he explained, "I wanted you to have a complete record of everything we've built together in these gardens. If anything ever happens to me, this journal will help whoever comes after me understand the careful work that's been done here." Looking through the journal, I saw my estate's grounds documented with the kind of meticulous attention and genuine pride that spoke to Diego's deep connection to his work and his respect for the beauty we had created together. As the evening concluded and my unexpected guests prepared to leave, I realized this simple, spontaneous celebration had been more meaningful than the elaborate formal dinner I had originally planned. These were people who understood that presence truly was more important than presence, that respect was demonstrated through actions rather than words, and that family loyalty was defined by character rather than genetics. "Thank you," I said to the Martinez family as they gathered their things to leave. "This has been the most beautiful birthday celebration I could have imagined." "Mrs. Ashworth," Rosa replied in her accented but careful English, "it was our honor. You have been like family to us for many years. Today we just made it official." After they left, I sat alone in the conservatory, surrounded by the orchids that Diego had carefully tended, holding the journal that documented our 14-year collaboration in creating something beautiful. The contrast between this genuine celebration and my son's casual abandonment was so stark it took my breath away. Ben had dismissed my 80th birthday as less important than a work emergency that could have been handled on any other day. Diego had registered an orchid variety in my name and spent months preparing a gift that would honor our relationship for years to come. Ben offered a future lunch to make up for missing my milestone birthday. The Martinez family had spontaneously created a celebration that honored the significance of reaching 80 with thoughtfulness, tradition, and genuine joy. Ben treated me like a burden to be managed with minimal effort and maximum convenience.
Diego and his family treated me like someone worthy of respect, attention, and celebration. As I prepared for bed that night, I walked through each room of the estate that Winston and I had lovingly restored over 5 decades, thinking about legacy, family, and the true meaning of inheritance. The beautiful home, the successful business, the substantial wealth we had accumulated. What was the point of any of it if the people who were supposed to inherit our life's work didn't understand or appreciate the values that had made it possible? But I also thought about the secret that I had been keeping for the past 2 years, the decision that I had been contemplating since my 78th birthday, and the legal documents that were already prepared and waiting in my attorney's office. What Ben didn't know was that his behavior over the past several years had already convinced me to make some significant changes to my estate planning, changes that would reflect my true values and ensure that the Ashworth legacy would be preserved by people who actually understood its meaning and importance. The woman he thought was a lonely, manipulable widow was about to demonstrate just how clearly she could see the truth about the people in her life. And the inheritance he was casually taking for granted was about to become the most expensive lesson about respect, loyalty, and family values he would ever receive.
But tonight, surrounded by the beauty that Diego had helped create and holding the orchid that would forever bear my name, I felt a profound sense of peace about the decisions I was about to make. The 80th birthday that had begun with abandonment and disappointment had ended with the discovery of genuine family. Not the family of genetics, but the family of choice, respect, and shared values. Tomorrow, I would begin the process that would ensure my legacy went to people who had earned it through consistent kindness, genuine respect, and understanding that some things in life matter more than convenience or personal advantage. The son who couldn't be bothered to honor his mother's 80th birthday was about to discover that actions have consequences, and that the inheritance he had been assuming was his by right was about to be given to someone who had actually demonstrated the family values he had forgotten. After my son Benjamin abandoned my 80th birthday celebration with 4 hours' notice, claiming a work emergency was more important than his mother's milestone, I experienced the most beautiful birthday celebration of my life with Diego Martinez, my gardener, and his family. They showed me what genuine respect and family values look like. But as I began examining Ben's behavior more closely in the days following my birthday, I discovered a systematic campaign of manipulation that would shock me to my core. The morning after my birthday, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The contrast between Ben's casual dismissal and the Martinez family's genuine celebration had illuminated something I had been trying to ignore for too long. My son's behavior wasn't just disappointing, it was part of a pattern that had been carefully designed to position me as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, while simultaneously extracting maximum financial benefit from our relationship. I decided to do something I hadn't done since Winston's death 7 years earlier. I would examine my relationship with Ben with the same analytical approach I had used to evaluate investment opportunities for our high net worth clients. If Benjamin Ashworth were a potential client seeking my financial advice, what would my professional assessment tell me about his character, his reliability, and his worthiness as a steward of substantial assets? That Wednesday morning, I retrieved 7 years' worth of bank statements, canceled checks, and financial records from the secure filing system Winston and I had maintained in our home office. What I discovered when I spread these documents across my mahogany desk made my blood run cold with rage and disbelief. Since Winston's death in 2017, I had given Ben what I calculated to be $394,000 in loans, investments, and emergency assistance. Not a single dollar had ever been repaid, despite elaborate written promises and detailed repayment schedules that Ben had presented with such apparent sincerity that I had actually believed his commitments were genuine.
The financial extraction had been methodical and sophisticated, far more calculated than I had realized while it was happening. Ben had developed multiple strategies for obtaining money, each designed to make me feel like a generous, loving mother rather than a victim of systematic exploitation. Ben alone had extracted $127,000 through what he called business investment opportunities. The pattern was always identical. A crisis would emerge that required immediate financial intervention, accompanied by detailed business plans showing guaranteed returns, followed by several months of small token payments to maintain the illusion of legitimate repayment, followed by the quiet disappearance of any mention of the debt. The $85,000 to prevent foreclosure on his Heinsberg property had been presented with a comprehensive 15-page financial analysis showing how his consulting business would generate sufficient revenue to repay me with 8% annual interest within 10 months. 3 years later, the consulting business had vanished without explanation, and when I had gently inquired about repayment, Ben had acted genuinely confused, as if the money had been a gift rather than a carefully documented loan. The $42,000 for his organic farming venture had come with professional agricultural projections, soil analysis reports, and market studies showing the growing demand for organic produce in Vermont. Ben had convinced me that this investment would provide him with sustainable income while generating regular dividends from my investment. The farming operation had lasted 18 months before Ben quietly announced that market conditions had made organic farming temporarily unviable. Stephanie's financial history was equally disturbing, but far more emotionally manipulative. Over 7 years, she had extracted $156,000 through requests that were always framed as urgent family needs rather than personal desires. The $47,000 for Isabella's college preparation services had been presented as essential investments in my granddaughter's educational future. Premium SAT tutoring, private college counselors, application consultants, and campus visit expenses had consumed enormous amounts of money, while Stephanie expressed profound gratitude for my willingness to invest in Isabella's success. What I discovered through careful investigation was that many of these essential services had never been purchased. The expensive college counselor turned out to be Stephanie's friend from book club who had charged inflated rates for services she was unqualified to provide. The premium SAT tutoring were group sessions at the local library that cost a fraction of what Stephanie had requested.
The $38,000 for family medical emergencies had followed a pattern that was particularly manipulative. Stephanie would call in apparent distress about medical situations that required immediate cash payments, dental work that couldn't wait, specialist consultations that weren't covered by insurance, emergency room visits that had resulted in unexpected bills. Each medical crisis was presented with such emotional intensity that questioning the necessity or cost would have made me seem heartless and uncaring. Only later did I realize that these emergencies had coincided perfectly with Stephanie's desires for luxury purchases that she couldn't afford on their actual income. The $71,000 for home repairs and safety improvements had been justified as necessary expenses to protect my grandchildren's welfare. The farmhouse in Heinsberg apparently required constant maintenance that Ben and Stephanie couldn't afford. Roof repairs, heating system updates, electrical work that was supposedly creating fire hazards. When I had offered to hire contractors directly to ensure the work was completed properly, Stephanie had insisted that they had reliable local people who could do the work more affordably. The money had been transferred directly to their accounts, and I had never received any documentation showing that the repairs had actually been completed. But what made this financial manipulation even more insidious was how Ben and Stephanie had begun framing my generosity as evidence of my declining judgment and increasing vulnerability to financial exploitation. "Mother, we're concerned that you're not keeping proper track of family financial arrangements," Ben had said during a conversation 6 months earlier. "You seem confused about which payments were gifts and which were loans.
Maybe you should consider letting me help you organize your financial records more systematically. Eleanor, we're worried that you're being too generous with people who might be taking advantage of your kindness. At your age, you need to be more careful about protecting your assets from people who might not have your best interests at heart. They had turned my generosity into proof of my incompetence, and my questions about repayment into evidence that I was becoming confused about financial arrangements I had supposedly authorized but couldn't remember clearly. As I continued my investigation, I discovered that the financial manipulation was just one component of a much more comprehensive campaign designed to establish that Eleanor Ashworth was no longer capable of managing her own affairs independently. The campaign had multiple coordinated elements, all designed with strategic planning that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of elder manipulation techniques. Ben and Stephanie had developed an elaborate system for making me question my own memory and decision-making abilities. They would reference conversations that had never occurred, claim I had agreed to arrangements we had never discussed, and express concerned surprise when I couldn't recall events that had never happened. Don't you remember, Mother? We talked extensively about this last month when you mentioned feeling overwhelmed with managing the estate's financial complexities. You specifically asked me to take a more active role in helping you make important decisions because you were worried about making mistakes. I would search my memory desperately, trying to recall such a conversation, wondering if I was indeed becoming forgetful. When I couldn't remember discussions they claimed we'd had, my confusion was treated as confirmation that my memory was declining significantly. Stephanie had perfected a technique of bringing up family events or shared experiences with crucial details altered, then acting worried when I corrected her version. "Remember when Winston taught the children to fish at the pond behind the house?" she would say during family phone calls. "You seemed so proud watching them learn together." That wasn't at our pond, Stephanie. That was at Lake Champlain during our family vacation, and Winston was already too ill to teach anyone fishing by then, I would correct her. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm becoming concerned about you," she would respond with a sad, patronizing tone. "Your memory of family events isn't as reliable as it used to be. Perhaps we should start documenting these important moments so you don't get confused about our family history." I began noticing that my social connections were systematically being undermined through a combination of scheduling conflicts and subtle interference that isolated me from independent sources of support and validation. When longtime friends would telephone to invite me to cultural events, charitable functions, or social gatherings, Ben or Stephanie would coincidentally need my urgent assistance with family matters that required my immediate attention and presence. "Mother, I hate to ask when I know you have plans with Mrs. Thornton, but Stephanie is at the emergency room with Winston, and we need someone to stay with Isabella. Could you possibly reschedule your garden club meeting? This is really a family emergency." The emergency would invariably prove to be something minor. Winston had sprained his ankle during soccer practice and needed ice in observation, or Isabella had a migraine that required someone to drive her home from school. But my social engagement would be disrupted, and my friends would be left with the impression that I was unreliable or that family crises were constantly consuming my life. Over time, the invitations became less frequent. Friends began assuming that I was too overwhelmed with family responsibilities to maintain social commitments, and I found myself increasingly isolated from the community relationships that had been important sources of independent validation and intellectual stimulation.
Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, my closest friend from 30 years of garden club membership, eventually stopped calling altogether. When I finally contacted her to inquire about upcoming meetings, she gently explained that she had assumed I was no longer interested in participating since I had missed so many recent gatherings due to family obligations. Perhaps most disturbing was how Ben and Stephanie had begun undermining my relationships with professional service providers, positioning themselves as my necessary intermediaries and advocates, while simultaneously establishing that I could no longer handle complex communications or decisions independently. When contractors arrived at the estate for routine maintenance or improvement projects,
Ben would often appear unannounced to help Mother communicate her requirements clearly. He would proceed to contradict my instructions, explain to the contractors that I sometimes became confused about technical specifications, and establish himself as the reliable contact for all future work. My mother isn't as sharp about construction details as she used to be, he would tell contractors with apparent concern for my welfare. She gets overwhelmed by complex decisions, so it's probably better if you coordinate directly with me to ensure everything gets completed according to her actual needs. Stephanie had begun accompanying me to medical appointments, supposedly to provide support and assistance, but actually to speak for me and interpret my communications with healthcare providers. She would interrupt when I was describing symptoms or concerns, elaborate on health issues I hadn't mentioned, and privately request that doctors contact her directly with important information because I sometimes became confused by medical terminology. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, my internist for 15 years, had begun directing questions to Stephanie rather than to me during appointments, apparently accepting Stephanie's characterization that I needed assistance understanding medical information and treatment recommendations. Ben had also begun involving himself in my business correspondence with Ashworth Financial Services clients and suppliers, claiming that he wanted to learn about the family business while helping me manage workload that was becoming too demanding for someone my age to handle effectively. These interventions were always presented as loving support from concerned family members who wanted to ensure I received optimal service and care. But their actual effect was to systematically undermine my credibility with professionals while establishing Ben and Stephanie as my de facto guardians and decision makers. As my investigation deepened, I realized that my son and daughter-in-law weren't just undermining my competence randomly. They were building a comprehensive narrative that would support legal intervention if I ever resisted their increasing control over my life and assets. Ben had been particularly systematic about establishing medical documentation for my supposed cognitive decline. He had contacted Dr. Caldwell's office multiple times over the past 18 months to express concerns about my mental clarity and decision-making capacity. "I'm worried about Mother's judgment," he had told Dr. Caldwell during a phone conversation I learned about only through careful questioning. "She's been making impulsive financial decisions, getting confused about family arrangements, and becoming resistant to assistance when she clearly needs help. Is there some type of cognitive evaluation you could conduct to assess whether she's developing dementia or other age-related mental problems?" Dr. Caldwell, who had known me for 15 years and recognized that I was mentally sharp and perfectly capable, had assured Ben that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment during regular checkups. But Ben had persisted, requesting that she monitor me more closely for signs of confusion or memory problems, and suggesting that family members might need to be consulted about my medical care to ensure I was receiving appropriate treatment. Stephanie had taken a different approach, researching depression and grief-related cognitive changes to build a case that my mental state had deteriorated since Winston's death. She had contacted Dr. Caldwell's office to discuss her observations of my withdrawal from social activities, my obsessive focus on preserving Winston's memory, and her concern that I was living in the past instead of adapting to current realities. "Eleanor seems stuck in grief," she had explained to the medical office staff. "She spends hours looking through old photographs and business records, talking about Winston as if he were still alive, and making decisions based on what she thinks he would have wanted, rather than what makes practical sense for her current situation." Ben had been building a case for my financial incompetence by documenting instances where I had been generous with family members while supposedly neglecting my own needs or making what he characterized as poor investment decisions. He had created a detailed file of every gift or loan I had made to family members over the past several years, presenting these as evidence that I was being exploited by people who were taking advantage of my loneliness and confusion. The fact that he and Stephanie were the primary recipients of my generosity was conveniently overlooked in his analysis.
Mother is giving away substantial amounts of money without maintaining proper records or considering tax implications. He had explained to my accountant, Harrison Webb, during a meeting I hadn't authorized. She's also discussing major changes to her estate planning without understanding how these decisions might affect her long-term financial security. I believe she needs professional guidance to protect her from making choices she might regret. He had also begun expressing concern that I was vulnerable to financial scams and predatory business practices, citing instances where I had made charitable contributions or professional service decisions without consulting family members first. My decision to hire a new landscaping company without obtaining multiple competitive bids became evidence that I was easily influenced by persuasive salespeople. My contribution to the Vermont Historical Society's capital campaign was characterized as proof that I was susceptible to emotional manipulation by organizations that target elderly donors. Both Ben and Stephanie had been carefully documenting instances where I had needed assistance or had difficulty managing tasks independently while simultaneously creating conditions that made such assistance appear necessary. They would arrive unannounced during times when I was likely to be occupied or slightly disheveled, early morning hours, late evening, or during household maintenance projects, and then express concern about my appearance or the condition of the estate. "Mother, you look exhausted," Ben would observe when he found me working in the conservatory on Saturday mornings, wearing gardening clothes and with soil under my fingernails. "Are you certain you should be doing this type of physical work at your age? What if you fell and injured yourself with no one available to help?" They would create minor crises that required my immediate attention, then arrive to rescue me while documenting my stress and confusion as evidence that I was struggling to cope with daily responsibilities independently. Eleanor seemed really overwhelmed when I arrived to help with the plumbing problem, Stephanie would tell Ben after assisting me with a bathroom faucet that had mysteriously begun leaking during one of her visits. She didn't know which contractors to call or how to handle the situation properly. "I'm worried about what might happen if she experienced a real emergency, and none of us were available to provide assistance." They had also begun coordinating their visits and communications to ensure that someone was constantly monitoring my activities and decisions, while creating the appearance that I was becoming increasingly dependent on family support for basic daily functioning. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their manipulation campaign was how they had begun positioning themselves as the natural protectors of family assets and the inevitable inheritors of properties that needed preservation for future generations. Ben had appointed himself as the family authority on the estate's condition and maintenance requirements, conducting regular inspections that invariably resulted in problems that required immediate attention and significant financial investment. "Mother, the foundation on the north side is showing some concerning settlement cracks. This could develop into a major structural problem if it's not addressed promptly. You really need to have professional engineers evaluate this before the damage becomes more extensive." When I would research the supposed problems and discovered they were normal settling issues that required monitoring but not immediate expensive repairs, Ben would express concern that I wasn't taking property maintenance seriously enough and that my reluctance to spend money on necessary improvements was evidence of poor judgment about asset preservation.
What I didn't understand at the time was that he was also researching the resale value of specific items and developing comprehensive knowledge of which pieces would be most profitable if the estate's contents ever needed to be liquidated. Both Ben and Stephanie had begun inserting themselves into Ashworth Financial Services operations, claiming they wanted to understand the family business while actually positioning themselves as essential assistants for a company that was becoming
too complex for me to manage alone. Ben had convinced me to add him as an authorized signatory on the business banking accounts, explaining that this would ensure operational continuity if I ever became ill or unavailable during critical business periods. Once he had access, he began monitoring all financial transactions and questioning expenditures that he didn't understand or approve. "Mother, this payment to the investment research service seems excessive," he would say while reviewing monthly statements. "Are you certain you're receiving competitive rates for these services? Perhaps I should research alternative options to ensure the business isn't overpaying for unnecessary services." Stephanie had volunteered to help with client communications and relationship management, claiming that her social skills and organizational abilities could help expand the business and improve client satisfaction. She had gradually taken over much of the client correspondence and meeting coordination, positioning herself as a partner rather than an assistant. Together, they had created a situation where Ashworth Financial Services appeared to be completely dependent on their involvement and oversight, making it seem natural and necessary for them to assume control if I ever became unable to continue working. The most chilling discovery of my investigation was evidence that Ben and Stephanie had already begun consulting with legal professionals about the procedures for gaining control over my affairs if I continued to resist their increasing involvement in my decision-making. I found handwritten notes in Stephanie's purse that detailed specific instances where I had supposedly demonstrated confusion, poor judgment, or inability to manage complex responsibilities independently. These notes were clearly intended to serve as evidence in legal proceedings, with dates, potential witnesses, and detailed descriptions of each incident. April 8, Eleanor seemed confused about the investment account statements, couldn't remember authorizing recent stock purchases, and had to ask Ben to explain basic financial terms she's used for 40 years. The reality was that I had questioned Ben about stock purchases he had made without my explicit authorization, using his signatory access to make investments I hadn't approved. But Stephanie's notes transformed my reasonable objections into evidence of cognitive decline. May 15, Eleanor forgot about dinner plans with the Harrison Webbs, seemed surprised when they arrived at the agreed time, had no food prepared, appeared disoriented about scheduling and social obligations. The truth was that Ben had changed our dinner plans without informing me, then failed to notify me that the Webbs were still expecting to join us at the originally scheduled time. But Stephanie's documentation made it appear that I was becoming forgetful and unreliable about social commitments. Ben had apparently consulted with an elder law attorney to discuss the procedures for obtaining conservatorship or guardianship over someone who was developing dementia or other cognitive impairments that affected their decision-making capacity. The key, he had explained to Stephanie during a conversation I overheard through the estate's intercom system, is documenting a consistent pattern of poor judgment and confusion over an extended period. We need to demonstrate that Mother is making decisions that put her at risk, both financially and physically, and that family intervention is necessary to protect her well-being and preserve family assets. Stephanie had researched the specific legal requirements for proving incompetence in Vermont courts, discovering that family members could petition for guardianship if they could demonstrate that an elderly person was no longer capable of managing their affairs safely and independently. Ben had been the most thorough in his legal research, consulting with a probate attorney about the processes for challenging estate planning decisions made by someone with questionable mental capacity. If Mother makes changes to her will or trust documents that seem irrational or heavily influenced by outside parties, the family can contest those changes by arguing that she wasn't mentally competent when she made them, or that she was under undue influence from people who don't have her best interests at heart. As I completed my investigation into their systematic manipulation campaign, I realized that Ben's casual cancellation of my 80th birthday celebration hadn't been an isolated incident of selfishness. It had been part of a comprehensive plan to establish that I was no longer worthy of respect, consideration, or autonomy. They had been building a case that Eleanor Ashworth was a confused, lonely widow whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose financial decisions needed supervision, and whose substantial assets required protection from her own supposedly declining capabilities. The accomplished businesswoman who had co-built a multi-million-dollar financial services firm was being systematically transformed into a legal incompetent whose family would reluctantly, but necessarily, assume control of her affairs.
But what Ben and Stephanie didn't know was that their systematic manipulation had actually been providing me with exactly the evidence I would need to protect myself and ensure that justice was ultimately served. The woman they thought was losing her mental faculties had actually been documenting their scheme with the same methodical attention to detail that had made Ashworth Financial Services successful for over 40 years. In the next part of this story, I'll reveal the secret I had been keeping for 2 years, the decision I had made about my estate planning that would completely transform their understanding of what they stood to inherit. I'll also show you how I began building my own comprehensive case, gathering evidence that would expose their manipulation while protecting the legacy that Winston and I had spent a lifetime creating. The woman they thought was becoming incompetent was actually preparing the most thorough lesson about respect, loyalty, and family values they would ever receive. And the inheritance they had been systematically working to secure was about to become the foundation for the most satisfying act of justice I had ever witnessed. The son and daughter-in-law who had spent years positioning themselves as my necessary caretakers were about to discover that their mother and mother-in-law had been several steps ahead of them throughout their entire manipulation campaign. I revealed the shocking scope of Ben and Stephanie's manipulation campaign. They had stolen $394,000 through fake emergencies, systematically undermined my credibility with doctors and contractors, and were building a legal case to have me declared incompetent so they could control my $4.8 million estate. But what they didn't know was that their systematic betrayal had awakened the strategic businesswoman who had spent 40 years building a financial empire. The woman they thought was a confused, isolated widow was about to reveal she had been several steps ahead of them all along. My awakening to the true nature of Ben and Stephanie's campaign began not with their cruelest betrayal, abandoning my 80th birthday, but 18 months earlier on a humid Thursday afternoon in July 2022. I had been reviewing quarterly reports for Ashworth Financial Services when I received a phone call that would fundamentally change my understanding of everything that had been happening in my family. The caller was Mrs. Vivian Blackstone, an 84-year-old widow who lived in Burlington and had been one of our most valued clients for over 20 years. She managed a trust fund worth approximately $2.3 million through our firm, and we had developed both a strong professional relationship and genuine personal friendship over the decades. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tension that immediately caught my attention. "I need to discuss something with you that's been troubling me greatly, and I hope you won't consider this an inappropriate intrusion into family matters." I assured her she could speak freely, recognizing that whatever she wanted to share was causing her considerable distress. Last Tuesday, I was attending the Burlington Country Club's charity luncheon with my daughter Margaret and several of her friends. One of the women mentioned that she knew your son Benjamin from their neighborhood business association meetings. She shared some information about your personal situation that deeply concerned me.
My heart began racing as I prepared to learn what Ben had been saying about me to virtual strangers in our community. This woman, I believe her name was Patricia Henning, said that Benjamin had confided in their group about how worried your family was becoming about your mental stability. She said he told them you were growing increasingly confused and forgetful, making questionable decisions about money, and that your family was having to intervene more frequently to protect you from your own poor judgment. The words struck me like physical blows. Ben wasn't just manipulating me directly, he was spreading malicious rumors throughout Burlington's social circles that I was mentally incompetent. But Eleanor, Mrs. Blackstone continued with growing conviction, I've conducted business with you for over 20 years, and I've never encountered anyone more intellectually sharp or professionally competent. Just 2 weeks ago, you provided brilliant analysis of the emerging technology sector that helped me restructure my portfolio to avoid significant losses. Either you're the most highly functional, confused person I've ever encountered, or something deeply troubling is happening here. Mrs. Blackstone's observation was like a spotlight illuminating a dark room. For months, I had been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if Ben and Stephanie's concerns about my mental clarity were valid, doubting my memory when they claimed we had discussed arrangements I couldn't recall. But Mrs. Blackstone was absolutely correct. I was functioning at peak capacity in every area of my life except my interactions with my own family. I was successfully managing complex investment portfolios, conducting sophisticated financial analysis, negotiating challenging client situations, and handling intricate regulatory compliance requirements. The only context where I appeared confused was in my responses to Ben and Stephanie's increasingly manipulative behavior. There's something else, Eleanor, Mrs. Blackstone added with obvious reluctance. This woman also mentioned that Benjamin had asked several people in their association to keep watch for you at community events, to report back if you seemed disoriented or said anything that suggested you were having difficulty managing your affairs. She seemed to think this was normal family concern, but it struck me as highly unusual and potentially inappropriate behavior.
After ending that call, I sat in my office for over an hour, processing the implications of what I had learned. Ben and Stephanie weren't just manipulating me, they were conducting a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation throughout Vermont's professional and social communities, recruiting community members as informants and witnesses, and methodically building public support for their narrative of my supposed incompetence. But Mrs. Blackstone's call had also provided me with something invaluable: objective validation that I was not losing my mental faculties or becoming incompetent. I was being deliberately manipulated by people who understood exactly what they were doing and had calculated that I was too trusting and loving to recognize their sophisticated scheme. That evening, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of confronting Ben and Stephanie directly or continuing to doubt my own perceptions and capabilities, I was going to investigate their behavior using the same methodical, analytical approach I had employed to build Ashworth Financial Services from nothing into one of Vermont's most respected wealth management firms. If they wanted to engage in strategic manipulation with someone they assumed was a confused elderly woman, they were about to discover they had chosen the wrong target entirely. The following morning, I began assembling what I privately called my Truth Coalition, a network of trusted professionals and reliable allies who could help me document what was actually happening while Ben and Stephanie continued their manipulation campaign, unaware that their target had become their investigator. My first call was to Marcus Wellington, the estate planning attorney who had handled Winston's will and our business legal matters for over 25 years. Marcus was not only professionally exceptional, but also personally trustworthy. He had known our family since Ben was in college and had observed the development of everyone's character over decades. Marcus,
I said when I reached his private office line that Wednesday morning. I need to schedule a highly confidential appointment to discuss some serious family concerns that may have significant legal implications. When I met with him 2 days later in his downtown Burlington office, I presented everything that had been happening. The systematic financial extraction, the coordinated undermining of my credibility with professionals, the rumors being circulated in the community, and my growing certainty that Ben and Stephanie were building a comprehensive case to have me declared legally incompetent. Marcus listened with increasing alarm and professional concern as I detailed the manipulation patterns I had identified. As someone who specialized in elder law and had extensive experience with financial abuse cases, he recognized the warning signs immediately and understood their serious implications. Eleanor, what you're describing represents a highly sophisticated form of elder financial abuse, combined with a systematic campaign to establish legal grounds for guardianship proceedings. This isn't typical family concern or even ordinary greed. This is a coordinated conspiracy to gain complete control over your substantial assets. He explained that Vermont law provided strong legal protections for elderly people facing exactly the type of manipulation I was experiencing, but that I would need comprehensive documentation to prove that the concerns Ben and Stephanie were expressing were fabricated and self-serving rather than genuine medical or safety issues. We need to create an extensive record of your actual mental capacity and decision-making competence, Marcus advised with the serious tone he used for critical legal matters. We also need to document their financial extraction patterns and manipulative behavior comprehensively. If they ever attempt to petition for guardianship or challenge your estate planning decisions in court, we want to be prepared with overwhelming evidence that demonstrates their true motivations and your complete mental competence. Marcus agreed to work with me confidentially to gather evidence and prepare legal protections that would prevent Ben and Stephanie from gaining any control over my affairs, regardless of what claims they might make about my mental capacity or decision-making abilities. My next step was addressing the medical component of their manipulation campaign. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patricia Caldwell to discuss the concerns Ben and Stephanie had been expressing about my mental health and to request formal documentation of my actual cognitive and psychological status. Dr. Caldwell was visibly uncomfortable with the situation she had been placed in. Eleanor, your son has contacted our office several times expressing worry about potential memory problems and confusion. But honestly, I've observed no evidence whatsoever of cognitive decline during your regular appointments. You're as mentally sharp and articulate as you've ever been throughout our 15-year professional relationship.
I explained my suspicion that Ben and Stephanie were building a false case for my incompetence as part of the calculated scheme to gain control over my assets. Dr. Caldwell immediately grasped the serious implications and agreed to provide comprehensive professional documentation of my mental competence. Over the following 6 weeks, I underwent extensive cognitive testing, psychological evaluation, neurological assessment, and comprehensive medical examination. Every single test confirmed what I already knew. My mental faculties were completely intact, my decision-making capacity was unimpaired, my memory was excellent for my age, and there was absolutely no medical evidence to support Ben and Stephanie's claims about declining competence. Dr. Caldwell provided me with detailed written reports documenting my cognitive health, specifically noting that she had found no evidence of dementia, depression, anxiety disorders, or any other conditions that would affect my judgment or autonomy. She also documented the complete timeline of Ben's inquiries and her consistent responses, creating an official record that would demonstrate his knowledge that his expressed concerns were medically unfounded. To address the financial aspects of their manipulation comprehensively, I hired Catherine Morrison Chen, a certified forensic financial analyst who specialized in elder financial abuse investigations. Catherine was recommended by Marcus and had extensive experience documenting and testifying about financial exploitation schemes in Vermont courts.
I provided Catherine with complete access to my financial records, bank statements, business accounts, and documentation of every loan, gift, or financial assistance I had provided to Ben and Stephanie's family over the past 7 years. Her detailed analysis revealed patterns that were even more disturbing and sophisticated than I had realized during my initial investigation. Mrs. Ashworth, Catherine explained after completing her comprehensive review, your son and daughter-in-law have systematically extracted over $394,000 from you through a combination of fabricated emergencies, unfulfilled promises, emotional manipulation, and coordinated deception. More concerning from a legal perspective is that they've created a documented pattern of requesting money for specific stated purposes that were never fulfilled, then using your generosity as evidence of your allegedly poor financial judgment. Catherine's analysis documented how Ben and Stephanie had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting money while simultaneously building their case that I was financially irresponsible, easily manipulated, or cognitively impaired. She also discovered evidence that they had been coordinating their financial requests strategically to maximize their total extraction while minimizing the appearance of individual dependency or exploitation. This isn't random financial neediness or even typical family financial dependency, Catherine concluded in her official report. This represents a systematic wealth transfer scheme specifically designed to drain your assets while positioning themselves as your necessary financial guardians and eventual inheritors. On Marcus's strong recommendation, I also retained Rebecca Lou Santos, a licensed private investigator who specialized in family financial fraud and elder abuse cases. Rebecca's assignment was to document Ben and Stephanie's actual behavior, communications, and statements to third parties, particularly their claims about my mental state and their discussions of my assets. Rebecca was remarkably thorough and creative in her investigative approach. She attended community events where Ben and Stephanie were likely to be present, engaged them in casual conversations about family matters through mutual acquaintances, and systematically documented their public statements about my condition and their concerns about my decision-making abilities. Through her 6-month investigation, Rebecca discovered that Ben had been telling people throughout Burlington and Shelburne that I was declining mentally and that the family was preparing for difficult decisions about mother's independence and financial management. Stephanie had been expressing concern to her social contacts that I was living in the past rather than facing current realities and making emotional rather than rational choices about important financial and legal matters. Most damaging to their credibility was evidence that both Ben and Stephanie had been discussing specific aspects of my estate with multiple people and sharing their detailed expectations about inheritance distribution. Rebecca recorded conversations where they speculated about property values, debated the optimal timing of my inevitable cognitive decline, and made concrete plans for managing family assets once they gained legal control. While assembling my team of professional allies, I also began conducting my own comprehensive investigation into something Ben and Stephanie had apparently overlooked completely in their eagerness to gain control of my obvious assets. The full scope and complexity of what Winston and I had actually accumulated during our 43-year marriage and professional partnership. The estate, the financial services business, and the visible investment accounts they knew about represented only the most obvious portion of our wealth. Winston had been a man who believed deeply in diversification, privacy, and strategic asset protection. And over the decades, we had built several additional revenue streams and asset categories that I had never discussed with Ben or anyone else in the family. What Ben and Stephanie didn't know was that Ashworth Financial Services had been systematically purchasing and holding real estate investments throughout Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts for over 25 years. These properties were held under a separate business entity that Winston had created specifically to keep them isolated from our primary business operations and invisible to casual observers.
I explained my suspicion that Ben and Stephanie were building a false case for my incompetence as part of a calculated scheme to gain control over my assets. Dr. Caldwell immediately grasped the serious implications and agreed to provide comprehensive, professional documentation of my mental competence. Over the following 6 weeks, I underwent extensive cognitive testing, psychological evaluation, neurological assessment, and comprehensive medical examination. Every single test confirmed what I already knew. My mental faculties were completely intact. My decision-making capacity was unimpaired. My memory was excellent for my age, and there was absolutely no medical evidence to support Ben and Stephanie's claims about declining competence. Dr. Caldwell provided me with detailed written reports documenting my cognitive health, specifically noting that she had found no evidence of dementia, depression, anxiety disorders, or any other conditions that would affect my judgment or autonomy. She also documented the complete timeline of Ben's inquiries and her consistent responses, creating an official record that would demonstrate his knowledge that his expressed concerns were medically unfounded. To address the financial aspects of their manipulation comprehensively, I hired Catherine Morrison Chen, a certified forensic financial analyst who specialized in elder financial abuse investigations. Catherine was recommended by Marcus and had extensive experience documenting and testifying about financial exploitation schemes in Vermont courts. I provided Catherine with complete access to my financial records, bank statements, business accounts, and documentation of every loan, gift, or financial assistance I had provided to Ben and Stephanie's family over the past 7 years. Her detailed analysis revealed patterns that were even more disturbing and sophisticated than I had realized during my initial investigation. Mrs. Ashworth, Catherine explained after completing her comprehensive review, your son and daughter-in-law have systematically extracted over $394,000 from you through a combination of fabricated emergencies, unfulfilled promises, emotional manipulation, and coordinated deception. More concerning from a legal perspective is that they've created a documented pattern of requesting money for specific stated purposes that were never fulfilled, then using your generosity as evidence of your allegedly poor financial judgment. Catherine's analysis documented how Ben and Stephanie had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting money while simultaneously building their case that I was financially irresponsible, easily manipulated, or cognitively impaired. She also discovered evidence that they had been coordinating their financial requests strategically to maximize their total extraction while minimizing the appearance of individual dependency or exploitation. This isn't random financial neediness or even typical family financial dependency, Catherine concluded in her official report. This represents a systematic wealth transfer scheme specifically designed to drain your assets while positioning themselves as your necessary financial guardians and eventual inheritors. On Marcus's strong recommendation, I also retained Rebecca Lou Santos, a licensed private investigator who specialized in family financial fraud and elder abuse cases. Rebecca's assignment was to document Ben and Stephanie's actual behavior, communications, and statements to third parties, particularly their claims about my mental state and their discussions of my assets. Rebecca was remarkably thorough and creative in her investigative approach. She attended community events where Ben and Stephanie were likely to be present, engaged them in casual conversations about family matters through mutual acquaintances, and systematically documented their public statements about my condition and their concerns about my decision-making abilities. Through her 6-month investigation, Rebecca discovered that Ben had been telling people throughout Burlington and Shelburne that I was declining mentally and that the family was preparing for difficult decisions about my independence and financial management. Stephanie had been expressing concern to her social contacts that I was living in the past rather than facing current realities and making emotional rather than rational choices about important financial and legal matters. Most damaging to their credibility was evidence that both Ben and Stephanie had been discussing specific aspects of my estate with multiple people and sharing their detailed expectations about inheritance distribution. Rebecca recorded conversations where they speculated about property values, debated the optimal timing of my inevitable cognitive decline, and made concrete plans for managing family assets once they gained legal control.
While assembling my team of professional allies, I also began conducting my own comprehensive investigation into something Ben and Stephanie had apparently overlooked completely in their eagerness to gain control of my obvious assets. The full scope and complexity of what Winston and I had actually accumulated during our 43-year marriage and professional partnership. The estate, the financial services business, and the visible investment accounts they knew about represented only the most obvious portion of our wealth. Winston had been a man who believed deeply in diversification, privacy, and strategic asset protection. And over the decades, we had built several additional revenue streams and asset categories that I had never discussed with Ben or anyone else in the family.
What Ben and Stephanie didn't know was that Ashworth Financial Services had been systematically purchasing and holding real estate investments throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts for over 25 years. These properties were held under a separate business entity that Winston had created specifically to keep them isolated from our primary business operations and invisible to casual observers. The real estate portfolio included 18 rental properties in historic districts and college towns throughout New England, ranging from small apartments in Middlebury to commercial buildings in Portsmouth. The total current value of these properties had grown to over $3.2 million, generating annual rental income of approximately $220,000 after all expenses and professional management fees. Ben and Stephanie had no knowledge of these properties because the rental income was deposited directly into business accounts they had never seen, and all properties were managed through a professional property management company in Boston that handled tenant relations, maintenance issues, and financial reporting without any involvement from our primary residence. Through 4 decades in the wealth management business, Winston and I had acquired an extraordinary collection of American folk art, rare books, and vintage financial instruments, many of which we had purchased at substantial discounts from clients who needed quick liquidity or were settling complex estates. What appeared to casual observers as simply the tasteful furnishings and decorations of a well-appointed historic home was actually a carefully curated collection worth over $1.4 million. We had professional appraisals conducted every 3 years for insurance purposes, but we had never discussed the collection's investment value with Ben because we didn't want him to view our home as an asset warehouse or potential source of quick cash. The collection included several pieces that had appreciated dramatically over the years. A collection of shaker furniture that we had purchased for $3,200 in 1985 was now valued at over $65,000, and a series of 19th century Vermont landscape paintings we had acquired for $8,500 in the 1990s was currently worth more than $95,000. Perhaps most significantly, Winston's experience with international financial markets had led him to establish investment accounts in several stable foreign jurisdictions, particularly in Swiss and Canadian financial centers, where he had developed professional relationships through our wealth management clients. These accounts, which were completely legal and properly reported to American tax authorities according to all applicable regulations, contained diversified investments worth approximately $2.1 million. The accounts were managed by highly reputable international investment firms and generated steady returns that were automatically reinvested according to sophisticated strategic guidelines. Ben and Stephanie had no knowledge of these accounts because the statements were delivered to a private commercial mailbox that Winston had maintained for confidential business correspondence, and the investment income was deposited into specialized accounts they had never encountered or heard mentioned. Ashworth Financial Services had also been quietly expanding into related business areas that neither Ben nor Stephanie knew anything about. We had developed exclusive consulting relationships with family offices in 6 states, creating revenue streams that extended far beyond our original individual wealth management focus.
The business now included a specialized trust administration division that managed complex family trusts for ultra-high net worth clients, a private foundation consulting service that helped wealthy families establish and operate charitable foundations, and an exclusive family office advisory practice that provided comprehensive financial services to families with assets exceeding $50 million. These business expansions had required minimal additional investment because they leveraged our existing client relationships and professional expertise, but they had added over $180,000 annually to our business income and had created additional business assets worth approximately $450,000. Armed with comprehensive documentation of my actual mental and financial competence and detailed evidence of Ben and Stephanie's manipulation campaign, I began working with Marcus to create sophisticated legal protections that would prevent them from gaining any control over any aspect of my affairs, while also ensuring that my actual values and priorities would determine how my life's work would be preserved and distributed. The most important element of my legal preparation was the creation of multiple irrevocable trusts that would hold the majority of my assets while I remained alive and competent. These trusts were structured to protect my wealth from any future legal challenges while ensuring that assets would be distributed according to my actual wishes rather than Ben and Stephanie's expectations or demands. The trust structures were designed so that I retained complete control over all income from trust assets during my lifetime, but Ben and Stephanie would have absolutely no legal standing to challenge my decisions about trust management, asset distribution, or beneficiary designations. Even if they somehow succeeded in having me declared incompetent through fraudulent medical testimony, they could not gain any control over assets held in properly structured, irrevocable trusts.
Marcus explained that these types of trusts were specifically designed to protect elderly people from financial exploitation by family members who felt entitled to inheritances. Once assets are transferred into irrevocable trusts with properly drafted terms, he said, they are legally protected from claims by beneficiaries who believe they have been treated unfairly or who argue that the grantor was not competent when making distribution decisions. I also completely rewrote my will to reflect my actual values and my honest assessment of Ben and Stephanie's character based on their documented behavior patterns over the past several years. The new will was far more detailed and sophisticated than my previous simple document, and it included specific provisions that would make it extremely difficult for Ben and Stephanie to challenge successfully, even with expensive legal representation. The new will included comprehensive explanations of my decision-making process, specific references to the medical and psychological evaluations that documented my complete competence, and detailed citations of behavior patterns that had influenced my decisions about asset distribution and family relationships. Most importantly, the will included what Marcus called no contest clauses, with serious financial penalties that would automatically disinherit anyone who challenged the document's validity or attempted to argue that I was mentally incompetent when making these decisions. If your son and daughter-in-law try to argue that you were mentally incompetent when you made these decisions, Marcus explained, they will lose everything rather than simply receiving less than they expected. To prevent Ben and Stephanie from ever gaining legal control over my personal affairs or business operations, I created very specific and limited powers of attorney that could only be activated under narrowly defined medical circumstances and only with oversight from multiple independent professionals. Rather than giving Ben broad authority to make decisions on my behalf if I became incapacitated, I appointed Marcus as my primary agent with detailed instructions about how my affairs should be managed and what my actual preferences were for various scenarios. I also included provisions requiring independent medical opinions from multiple specialists before any powers of attorney could be activated, making it legally impossible for Ben and Stephanie to have me declared incompetent based on the opinions of doctors they had attempted to influence.
I also created detailed succession plans for Ashworth Financial Services that would ensure the business continued operating successfully and serving our clients regardless of what happened to me personally. Rather than leaving the business to Ben, who had no genuine experience, interest, or competence in wealth management, I created a structure that would transfer ownership to key employees who had demonstrated professional competence and client loyalty over many years. This succession plan included financial arrangements that would provide Ben with some ongoing benefit from the business's continued success, but would prevent him from gaining operational control over services he was not qualified to provide or client relationships he had no ability to maintain. The most emotionally significant aspect of my legal preparation involved completely reconsidering who deserved to benefit from the wealth and success that Winston and I had built through decades of hard work, professional excellence, and careful financial planning. Ben and Stephanie's behavior had convinced me that they were not suitable stewards for the legacy Winston and I had created. Their systematic manipulation, financial exploitation, and casual disrespect had demonstrated that they viewed our life's work primarily as a source of personal wealth, rather than as a responsibility to preserve and continue the values that had made our success possible. Instead of leaving the bulk of my estate to people who had proven they would likely squander it on lifestyle maintenance and personal consumption, I decided to create comprehensive charitable arrangements that would ensure our life's work continued benefiting the community and causes that had supported our success throughout our careers. The primary beneficiary of my estate would be the Winston and Eleanor Ashworth Foundation for Financial Education, which would be dedicated to providing financial literacy education, small business development support, and college scholarships for students pursuing careers in ethical financial services. The foundation would be funded with approximately $4.8 million from my estate, including the main residence, the financial services business, and the majority of my investment accounts. This arrangement would ensure our professional values and commitment to ethical financial services would continue benefiting Vermont communities for generations, while preventing Ben and Stephanie from simply liquidating everything for immediate personal gain. But the most emotionally significant aspect of my estate planning involved completely reconsidering who deserved to benefit from the wealth and success that Winston and I had built through decades of hard work, professional excellence, and careful financial planning. Ben and Stephanie's behavior had convinced me that they were not suitable stewards for the legacy Winston and I had created. Their systematic manipulation, financial exploitation, and casual disrespect had demonstrated that they viewed our life's work primarily as a source of personal wealth rather than as a responsibility to preserve and continue the values that had made our success possible. Instead of leaving the bulk of my estate to people who had proven they would likely squander it on lifestyle maintenance and personal consumption, I decided to create comprehensive charitable arrangements that would ensure our life's work continued benefiting the community and causes that had supported our success throughout our careers. The primary beneficiary of my estate would be the Winston and Eleanor Ashworth Foundation for Financial Education, which would be dedicated to providing financial literacy education, small business development support, and college scholarships for students pursuing careers in ethical financial services. The foundation would be funded with approximately $4.8 million from my estate, including the main residence, the financial services business, and the majority of my investment accounts. This arrangement would ensure our professional values and commitment to ethical financial services would continue benefiting Vermont communities for generations, while preventing Ben and Stephanie from simply liquidating everything for immediate personal gain. But the most personally meaningful change in my estate planning involved recognizing people in my life who had demonstrated genuine loyalty, respect, and understanding of what truly mattered in human relationships. Over my 14 years of working with Diego Martinez, I had observed qualities of character that Ben had never displayed: consistent reliability, genuine respect, appreciation for beauty, dedication to excellence, and understanding that some things in life were more important than personal convenience or financial advantage. Diego had never asked me for anything except the opportunity to do his job well. He had never manipulated me, lied to me, or treated me with anything less than complete respect and consideration. When my 80th birthday arrived, he had been the only person who truly understood its significance and had taken time from his own life to ensure it was properly celebrated.
The contrast between Diego's character and Ben's behavior was so stark that it had forced me to reconsider fundamental assumptions about family, loyalty, and who deserved to benefit from the wealth Winston and I had created. In my revised will, Diego Martinez would receive $500,000 in cash, along with the deed to the estate's guest cottage and 2 acres of surrounding land where he could establish his own landscaping and garden design business. This bequest would provide him with financial security and the opportunity to build his own professional legacy while ensuring that someone who truly appreciated the beauty of our estate would continue caring for it. Ben and Stephanie would each receive exactly $25,000, enough to demonstrate that I hadn't completely forgotten them, but far less than the millions they were expecting. These bequests would also come with detailed written explanations of how their documented behavior toward me had influenced my decisions about estate distribution and family relationships. The most devastating surprise I was preparing for Ben and Stephanie was the revelation of assets they had never known existed. All their scheming and manipulation had been focused on gaining control over what they thought was a $4.8 million estate, when the actual value of my holdings exceeded $9.1 million. Their greed and systematic manipulation had cost them not just the inheritance they were expecting, but access to wealth they couldn't have imagined existed. The real estate portfolio, the international investments, the art collection, and the expanded business operations they had never suspected would all be dedicated to charitable purposes and worthy individuals who had earned recognition through their character and actions. But perhaps the most satisfying element of my preparation was the comprehensive documentation I was creating to ensure that Ben and Stephanie would understand exactly why they had lost their expected inheritance and exactly what their manipulation had cost them. I had been systematically recording conversations in my own home using discrete audio equipment that Rebecca had helped me install in areas where family conversations typically occurred. Vermont is a one-party consent state, which meant I could legally record conversations in my own home as long as I was present and participating. Over the course of 8 months, I had recorded dozens of conversations that provided undeniable evidence of Ben and Stephanie's manipulation tactics, their discussions of my supposed incompetence, their coordination of financial extraction strategies, and their detailed plans for gaining control over my assets. One particularly revealing recording captured Ben and Stephanie discussing specific techniques for making me appear confused during family gatherings. "We need to ask Mother about events from years ago and act concerned when she doesn't remember every specific detail perfectly," Stephanie had said during a conversation in my own living room. "Normal people don't remember every conversation from 5 years ago, but we can present any memory gaps as evidence of cognitive problems." I also created detailed documentation of every financial request Ben and Stephanie had made over the past 7 years, including copies of their written justifications, records of promised repayment terms that were never honored, and evidence of how the money was actually used versus how they had claimed it would be used. This documentation revealed patterns that were even more disturbing when viewed comprehensively and chronologically. For example, I discovered that Ben and Stephanie had coordinated their requests strategically so that they never asked for large amounts simultaneously, but their combined extraction over any 12-month period was consistently substantial and increasing.
I also documented instances where they had used sophisticated emotional manipulation to extract money, such as Stephanie's technique of mentioning financial stress in seemingly casual conversation, then waiting for me to volunteer assistance that felt like my own generous impulse rather than a response to calculated manipulation. To counter any future claims about my mental capacity or decision-making abilities, I created an extensive portfolio documenting my actual cognitive function and professional competence throughout the period when Ben and Stephanie were claiming I was becoming confused and unreliable. This portfolio included business records showing complex negotiations I had completed successfully, sophisticated financial analysis I had performed for clients, correspondence demonstrating clear thinking and communication skills, and evidence of detailed strategic planning and problem-solving that would be impossible for someone experiencing any form of cognitive decline. I also documented my continued active involvement in community organizations, my successful management of the expanded financial services business, and my ability to handle complex logistical and administrative tasks that required sustained attention, memory, and analytical thinking. Perhaps most importantly, I created a detailed chronological timeline that demonstrated the direct correlation between Ben and Stephanie's increasing financial requests and their escalating expressions of concern about my mental competence. This timeline revealed that their worries about my judgment had appeared and intensified at exactly the same time as their own financial needs had begun growing, and their requests for assistance had become more frequent and more expensive.
The timeline also showed that their concerns about my decision-making abilities were highly selective and self-serving. They only questioned my mental competence when I was reluctant to provide financial assistance or asked questions about repayment, but they never expressed any concern about my mental clarity when I was generous with gifts, loans, or financial support for their lifestyle preferences. By October 2023, just 2 months before my disastrous 80th birthday celebration, I had completed all the legal, financial, and documentation work necessary to protect myself completely from Ben and Stephanie's manipulation, while ensuring that justice would ultimately be served in the most comprehensive and satisfying way possible. My assets were protected in multiple irrevocable trusts and sophisticated legal arrangements that Ben and Stephanie could not successfully challenge regardless of what claims they made about my mental competence. My cognitive and psychological health was documented by multiple independent medical professionals who could provide expert testimony that I was fully capable of making informed decisions about my affairs and my relationships. Their manipulation and financial exploitation were recorded and documented in ways that would make any legal challenges not only unsuccessful, but potentially costly for them personally through legal fees and court sanctions for frivolous litigation. Most importantly, I had created a comprehensive plan that would give Ben and Stephanie exactly what they had earned through their behavior, not the millions they were expecting and felt entitled to receive, but a profound lesson about the true value of family relationships and the serious consequences of treating someone you claim to love as nothing more than a source of financial benefit. The woman they thought was losing her mental faculties and becoming an easy target for manipulation had actually spent 20 months building an unassailable legal and financial fortress that would protect everything Winston and I had created while ensuring that people of genuine character would be rewarded for their loyalty and respect. Their casual abandonment of my 80th birthday celebration had provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to complete my case against them and the final emotional confirmation that my assessment of their character was accurate and my decisions about their inheritance were completely justified. What Ben and Stephanie didn't realize as they dismissed my milestone birthday as less important than Ben's work obligations was that they had just provided me with the ultimate validation that the strategic plan I had been developing for almost 2 years was not only necessary, but morally imperative. In the next part of this story, I'll reveal how I set the final trap that would expose their manipulation comprehensively, while giving them one last opportunity to reveal the complete extent of their greed, callousness, and disrespect.
The inheritance they had been systematically working to secure through manipulation and exploitation was about to become the foundation for the most comprehensive lesson about respect, gratitude, and family values they would ever receive. And the woman they thought was losing her mental faculties and becoming an easy target for manipulation was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who has spent a lifetime building, protecting, and preserving what truly matters. 3 weeks after my birthday, I invited Ben and Stephanie for what I called a New Year estate planning discussion. They arrived expecting to finally hear about their inheritance. Instead, they found Marcus Wellington, my attorney, with legal documents spread across my dining table. "Please sit," I said calmly. "We need to discuss your behavior and its consequences." Marcus presented our evidence methodically. $394,000 in financial extraction, recorded conversations of their manipulation tactics, medical evaluations proving my complete competence, and documentation of their campaign to have me declared incompetent. Their faces went from confusion to shock to horror as they realized the scope of what we had uncovered. "The total estate is worth $9.1 million, I announced, watching their expressions. "You spent years scheming for what you thought was $4.8 million, never bothering to understand what your parents actually built." Marcus read from my revised will. Ben and Stephanie would each receive $25,000, a fraction of the millions they expected. The remaining $9 million would fund the Winston and Eleanor Ashworth Foundation and provide Diego Martinez with $500,000 plus the guest cottage. Diego remembered my 80th birthday when you couldn't be bothered. He has shown me more genuine respect in 14 years than you've shown in 7. Ben tried to threaten legal challenges. Marcus calmly explained the no contest clauses. Any challenge would eliminate even their small bequests. As they left in stunned silence, I felt profound peace. 6 months later, the Ashworth Foundation opened in the estate's converted carriage house. Diego's landscaping business flourished on his new property. My children's names appeared in local papers only as cautionary tales about elder abuse. The woman they thought was losing her mental faculties had given them the most expensive education about respect and family values they would ever receive. And the gardener who understood that presence matters more than presents became the true heir to everything that mattered. Justice, as it turned out, was worth far more than money.